I was requested by the Ocean Hunter on Patreon to review the Netflix documentary Challenger: The Final Flight. This is a 3-hour documentary about the Challenger disaster in 1986 that sadly resulted in 7 deaths. This happened before I was born, so I obviously can't speak of the immediate shock that must have occurred when this happened, but I imagine the impact it must have had on the world. I didn't know too much about it, but this documentary did a great job of explaining the story. The filmmakers use a good mix of archival clips and new interviews to go into plenty of detail about what happened. It actually starts off by showing the Challenger exploding and the reaction from everyone watching on the ground, and then it goes back years earlier to provide the backstory and lead up to the event. The producers were able to get a decent assortment of participants, from some family members of the Challenger astronauts to people working at NASA and the manufacturing company Modern Theocol at the time. These interviews and the news footage used provide the necessary context that allow us to understand the astronauts and the decisions made. There are also recreations, but these are only used when necessary. As someone with limited knowledge of the event, I was able to piece things together, and the editors also paced it well. I found myself invested through most of the documentary, and it provided the right amount of information. One element The Final Flight puts an emphasis on was the decision to put someone who was not an astronaut as part of the crew. In the end, they felt a teacher was the best choice, and explains why this choice was made. There's quite a bit of time spent getting to know the astronauts, even ones who did not go on the shuttle, but it's Christa McAuliffe who gets the most attention. Through the clips shown, you sense the excitement she had about this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and how heartbreaking it must have been for her family and students when the disaster happened. A lot of teachers applied to be a part of that mission, and I assume all of them must have felt different kinds of emotions at the tragedy too. As the documentary plays on, there is that feeling of dread that eventually sets in. You know it's coming, especially when we circle back around to the launch date. There's the fear that begins when the countdown starts and we see the shuttle take off. As someone who not really watched the footage, I did not know when exactly the explosion would occur, and then it happens in an instant. The filmmakers knew exactly how to edit the footage as we see the reaction from the people at the Kennedy Space Center, news reporters, and those watching in schools. They are able to recreate that feeling of sadness and confusion that must have permeated that day. The saddest part is that the disaster was so easily preventable, as those concerned before the flight about the temperature that day and how it would affect the shuttle. However, they decided to go ahead with it anyway. The most shocking interview in the documentary comes from William Lucas, who was one of the people responsible for giving the go-ahead for the launch. He says at one point that even in retrospect, he still would have approved of the Challenger launch that day, despite knowing what he knows now. Why would you admit to that on camera? The final part of the documentary primarily looks into the Rogers Commission, which investigated the cause of the explosion. This is obviously important to look into, but I was expecting they would also touch on the overall mood of the world following the disaster and how it might have affected the employees at NASA and fellow astronauts. There's a bit of that, but not as much as I would have thought. The theme I took from Challenger: The Final Flight is the loss of excitement about the space program following that disastrous launch. According to the documentary, part of the reason they decided to put a teacher on board the flight was to renew people's interest in space exploration, which was apparently waning a bit in the 1980s. One of the ramifications of the disaster seemed to be that people lost that sense of awe about going to outer space. And come to think of it, it does seem like nowadays few treat it as a big deal, especially compared to when the United States was having its space race with the Soviets and successfully landed men on the moon in 1969. The most publicity that space launches appear to receive today is when some billionaire decides to take a trip on their expensive rocket ship, but the reaction they usually greet it with is why they didn't spend that money to help people on Earth who actually need it. When Neil Armstrong, Alan Shepard, and Yuri Gagarin took to the stars, it probably felt like humankind was taking the next great leap forward. When Jeff Bezos does it, you feel nothing. Back to Challenger: The Final Flight, this was an involving and heartbreaking documentary about a real tragedy. While I'm sure the filmmakers left some things out for the sake of time, it nonetheless succeeds as a well-put-together summary of events leading up to the launch date and the aftermath. It's a worthy tribute to those 7 astronauts who sadly lost their lives on something so easily preventable. If you've seen Challenger: The Final Flight on Netflix, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for the request, Ocean Hunter.